Picture a sheet of paper about the size of a placemat. It is printed on heavy stock in French with an ornamental border and an engraved allegorical figure in one corner. Along the bottom edge there is a row of small perforated rectangles, like stamps, each one carrying a date and an amount. Those are the coupons. You were supposed to clip one every 3 months, take it to your bank, and be paid. The certificate is a bond of the Imperial Russian government, sold in France, and there are millions of them still in existence. They turn up in-house clearances. They come out of shoeboxes when a grandparent dies. Collectors buy them for a few euros, sometimes for a little more if the engraving is attractive. And here's the detail you should hold on to. On most of the surviving certificates, the coupons are still attached. All of them, uncut, because after a certain date there was no longer any point walking to the bank. Now, that piece of paper was not an exotic gamble. It was, for a French household in 1906, close to the most respectable thing you could possibly own. Your bank recommended it, your newspaper praised it, the government of the Republic had an alliance with the country that issued it, and had personally authorized it to be sold on the Paris exchange. When France finally counted the damage in 1919, 1.6 million people came forward and declared holdings. So here's the question this video exists to answer. How does the safest investment in a country become worthless in a single page of text? Because that is what happened, not a slow decline, not a negotiated restructuring. One decree, in the winter of 1918, canceling every foreign loan of the Russian state without exception and without condition. It was the largest repudiation of sovereign debt ever carried out, and it was settled, partially, symbolically, 79 years later. Let me be precise about what I'm claiming, because there is a conspiratorial version of this story, and it is genuinely dangerous, and I'm going to take it apart later in this video rather than pretend it does not exist. I'm not going to tell you that bankers financed a revolution. That story is built on documents that were proved to be forgeries in the 1950s, and I will show you exactly which ones and who proved it. What I'm going to tell you is stranger and much better documented. The money that flowed from France to Russia for 30 years did not build Russian factories. It financed the Russian state. It bought the budget, the railways, the rearmament, and at one critical moment it bought the Russian government's independence from its own parliament. And when that state was overthrown, the new one discovered something that governments had suspected for a century but had rarely dared to test, that you can simply refuse. To understand how 1.6 million French families ended up as creditors of an autocracy 1,500 miles away, you have to start with a diplomatic problem, not a financial one. In the 1880s, France was isolated in Europe. It had lost a war to Germany in 1871, lost 2 provinces, and Berlin had spent the years since building a system of alliances designed to keep Paris alone. Russia had the opposite problem and the opposite asset. It had the largest army in Europe and a chronic shortage of capital. France had the savings. The Franco-Russian alliance was built between 1892 and 1894, and the money moved with it. And this is the critical detail. The flow was not a private market phenomenon that the two governments happened to approve of. It was steered. A Russian bond could not be listed on the Paris exchange without the permission of the French government, signed by the finance ministry, decided by the foreign ministry. That permission was granted, withheld, delayed, and traded as an instrument of policy. When Paris wanted something from St. Petersburg, the listing became difficult. When relations were good, the taps opened. The best historian of this subject put it in a way that inverts what most people assume. We tend to think finance drives diplomacy. In this case, at least as often, diplomacy drove the finance, and the distribution machinery was formidable. The great French deposit banks had built branch networks reaching into small provincial towns, the first mass retail banking system in continental Europe. Those counters had been created to gather the savings of ordinary people. Now they had a product to sell them. The pitch was simple, and for 30 years it was true. Russian state bonds paid appreciably more than French government bonds. They were issued by a government allied to your own. And no great European state had defaulted on its debt in living memory. There is a French phrase for this category of asset that has no good English equivalent, a security for the head of a household. Something you buy not to get rich, but to be responsible. You bought it when a daughter was born or when a farm was sold, and you put it in the drawer and you clipped the coupons 4 times a year. That is what was being sold, not an emerging market play, prudence. And the coupon was the whole ritual. 4 times a year you took a pair of scissors to a printed sheet, walked to the counter, and were handed cash. Nothing about that transaction felt like risk. It felt like a small pension arriving. Which is precisely why the story ends the way it does. When people say the bonds became worthless, they are describing a financial event. What actually happened in hundreds of thousands of French households was the quiet cancellation of an income that had been arriving on time 4 times a year, for as long as anyone in the room could remember. By 1913, the Russian public debt stood at around £930 million sterling. Estimates of how much of it was held in France range from roughly 40% to something closer to two-thirds, depending on what you count and when you count it. I am not going to give you a single tidy number, because the honest sources do not agree on one. What is not in dispute is the shape. Russia was one of the largest sovereign borrowers on earth, and the single largest concentration of its creditors was in France, and not in Parisian banks, in French households. Belgium held a substantial quantity too, and so in smaller measure did Britain and Germany. But France is where the retail machine was. And this is the point at which I have to correct the version of this story that I grew up with, because it is the version almost every documentary tells. You will hear it said that French savings built Russia, that the mines of the Donbass, the oil of Baku, the great industrial surge of the 1890s, all of it came out of Paris. The economic historians who actually rebuilt the Russian national accounts do not support that. Foreign capital inflows into Russia amounted to something like 2% of net national product. They were a large share of industrial investment in a few specific sectors, and a much smaller share of total investment in the country. The dominant source of Russian capital formation was Russian saving. So the sentence has to be rewritten, and the corrected version is sharper than the myth. French savings did not finance the Russian economy. French savings financed the Russian state. What was being bought in those provincial bank halls was not a factory. It was a government bond, the budget, the state railways, the army, the navy that would be sunk at Tsushima, and the interest on the previous loans. That distinction is not a technicality. It is the reason the repudiation of 1918 took the form it took. A revolution can expropriate a factory and still run it. A sovereign debt is not a thing you can seize. It is only a promise, and a promise can be cancelled with a sentence. And here is where the story becomes uncomfortable, because a product that large has to be advertised. The Russian finance ministry kept a financial agent in Paris. His name was Arthur Rafalovich, and his job was not only to negotiate with banks, it was to manage what French readers were told about Russia. Between 1900 and 1914, he distributed roughly 6.5 million gold francs to the French press. Not to one paper, to something like 40 of them across the political spectrum, the great Paris dailies, the conservative papers, the radical papers, the cheap mass circulation papers that were read on trains. The money bought two things. It bought favorable coverage of Russian finances at the moment of each new issue, and it bought silence, the suppression or softening of stories about Russian instability that might have made a schoolteacher in Limoges think twice. We know the amounts because the correspondence survived. After 1917, the Bolsheviks opened the Imperial Archives, and in December 1923, the French communist newspaper began publishing Rafalovich's letters in installments running into the spring of 1924. The series ran under a title that has stuck to the affair ever since, a phrase about the abominable venality of the French press. I want to be careful about what that proves and what it does not. It does not prove that the bonds were fraudulent. Russia really did pay its coupons punctually for 30 years. What it proves is that one of the two sources a French saver relied on to judge the risk, the bank counter and the newspaper, had been quietly bought by the borrower. And consider the position of the other one. The banks distributing the paper earned a commission on every issue. They were not lying to anybody. They were simply not the disinterested advisors their customers took them to be. So the household in the provinces was getting its information from two channels, both of which were being paid by the party on the other side of the trade. And now we come to the loan that matters most. In 1905, the Russian Empire had a catastrophic year. It lost a war to Japan, including its Baltic fleet, which had sailed halfway around the world to be destroyed in an afternoon. Then it had a revolution, a general strike, mutinies, a workers' council in the capital. In October 1905, cornered, Nicholas II issued a manifesto promising civil liberties and an elected assembly, the State Duma. Russia was to become, at least on paper, a constitutional monarchy. The Duma was scheduled to open on the 10th of May 1906 by the Western calendar, 27th of April by the Russian one, which was still running 13 days behind. On the 16th of April, 3.5 weeks before the deputies took their seats, the French government authorized the largest loan in Russian history, 2.25 billion gold francs. Look at those two dates together, because they are the whole story. The subscription was a sensation. The French tranche alone was 1.25 billion francs, and it was oversubscribed 10 times over, something like 12.5 billion francs of demand. It paid 5% at a time when French government debt paid around 3%. Roughly 1.5 million people rushed at it. And the Russian government now had enough money to run the state for years without asking its brand new parliament for anything. Now here is where I have to correct the version of this story that gets told on the internet, because the loose version is that this loan killed Russian democracy. It did not, and the real sequence matters. What actually constrained the First Duma was a set of laws promulgated before it ever sat. In April 1906, days before the opening, the government issued the Fundamental Laws, which reserved enormous powers to the Crown, including a provision allowing legislation by decree when the chamber was not in session. The Duma was dissolved after about 10 weeks, in a fight over land reform. Alone does not dissolve a parliament. Constitutional law and a decree do that. But the timing of the borrowing was not an accident, and that is the part that is documented and sufficient. The money was secured before the chamber sat so that the chamber could not vote on it, and the deputies said so. In July 1906, days after the dissolution, around 200 of them crossed into Finland and met at Viborg, where they issued a manifesto calling on Russians to refuse taxes and conscription, and warning that loans contracted without the consent of the people's representatives would not be recognized or repaid. That warning was addressed in effect to the savings banks of provincial France. It was ignored. 12 years later, it turned out to be the most accurate financial forecast of the century. Then came the war, and the borrowing stopped being a matter of choice. Russia's war was fought at the end of a supply line that barely functioned. The Ottoman closure of the straits shut the Black Sea. What was left were the northern ports, one of which froze, and a single railway across Siberia. Everything had to be bought abroad: rifles, shells, machine tools, locomotives, and paid for in currencies Russia did not have. So it borrowed. The British Treasury lent on the order of 5.4 billion rubles. France lent about 1.5 billion. Around a fifth of the Russian government's war spending was financed from abroad. And Britain, unlike the French retail saver, asked for collateral. Russian gold was crated and shipped to London and onward to Canada for safekeeping, running to tens of millions of pounds of bullion over the course of the war, exchanged for British Treasury paper. Think about what that means. The Empire's monetary reserves physically left the country, in ships, through waters patrolled by German submarines to sit in vaults belonging to its creditor. And now hold the two kinds of lending side by side, because the contrast is the whole argument of this video. When a state lends to another state, it asks for security, and it gets it, in this case bullion, crated and shipped and counted into a vault 4,000 miles away. When a household lends to a state, there is no security. There is a certificate with an engraving on it. So when the repudiation came, the British Treasury was sitting on Russian gold it already physically held, and the schoolteacher in Limoges was sitting on a piece of paper. Both were creditors of the same government. Only one of them had thought about what would happen if the promise failed. That asymmetry is not a scandal of 1918. It is the permanent structure of sovereign lending, and it has not changed once since. By late 1917, the total Russian debt had reached around £3,385 million, more than 3.5 times the pre-war figure in 4 years. And there is a chapter in between that almost everybody skips, and it matters enormously for what comes next. Between February and October 1917, Russia was not ruled by the Tsar. It was ruled by a provisional government, a liberal parliamentary administration recognized by France and Britain, which committed itself publicly to honoring the obligations of the Russian state. It borrowed too. It issued its own domestic war loan, and it drew further credits from its allies on the strength of that commitment. So by the autumn of 1917, the Russian debt had two distinct layers: the loans of an autocracy and the loans of the constitutional government that had replaced it. Hold that distinction, because it is about to be erased along with everything else, and it demolishes the tidiest argument anyone has ever made in defense of what happened next. That was the balance sheet that the Bolsheviks inherited in October 1917, and they did something with it that no great power had done. The decree annulling the state loans was adopted in the first weeks of 1918, February 3rd by the Western calendar, January 21st by the Russian one, and published about a week after that. You will see several different dates quoted for it, because Russia changed calendars in the middle of that same winter. Its content is brutally simple. All state loans, contracted by the previous governments, are annulled. All state guarantees on the borrowings of enterprises and institutions are annulled. And then the sentence that mattered to a school teacher in Limoges: all foreign loans are annulled without exception and without condition. But there is a clause in that decree that almost nobody quotes, and it is the one that tells you what the new government actually understood about debt. Small Russian holders, citizens holding less than 10,000 rubles of the cancelled paper, were to receive new certificates of the Soviet Republic in exchange, and savings bank deposits were left untouched. So the repudiation was not indiscriminate. It carefully protected the domestic small saver, and it destroyed the foreign one completely. That is not chaos. That is a political calculation about who you have to live with and who you do not. And now go back to the distinction I asked you to hold. The decree did not only cancel the debts of the autocracy, it canceled the borrowings of the provisional government as well, the elected constitutional administration that had governed Russia for 8 months and had been recognized by every allied power. That is why the most common defense of the repudiation does not survive contact with the document. The argument is that a people cannot be bound by what a tyrant borrowed against them. It is a serious argument, and I will come back to it later in this video, because it has a legal name and a long afterlife. But it does not describe this decree. This decree canceled everything: the Tsar's loans, the Parliament's loans, the loans raised to buy the rifles that were at that moment in the hands of Russian soldiers. The principle being applied was not that some debts are illegitimate. The principle was that the new state did not recognize the old state at all. The response of the creditor governments took 4 years to organize, and it collapsed inside a month. In April 1922, the powers met the Soviet delegation at Genoa. The demand was that Russia acknowledge the obligations of its predecessors, the imperial government and the provisional government that followed it. The Soviet Commissar for Foreign Affairs came to that conference with an argument that was very difficult to answer. He pointed out that a number of the states sitting around that table had themselves repudiated debts and obligations at various points in their own history, without being treated as outlaws for it. He argued that a revolution creates a new legal situation in a country's internal and external relations. And he suggested that the economic condition of Russia in 1922, after a world war, a civil war, and a famine, was itself sufficient grounds for release from its liabilities. I am giving you the substance of those arguments rather than pretending to quote them word for word, because the versions in circulation are translations of translations. But you can see what he was doing. He was not asking for forgiveness. He was telling a room full of European foreign ministers that they had all done this before. And while that conversation was going on, the Soviet and German delegations slipped away to a hotel at Rapallo on the coast and signed their own treaty, mutual cancellation of claims, full diplomatic recognition. The two outcasts of the European system had paired off, and the rest of the conference read about it in the newspapers. A follow-up conference at The Hague that summer got closer than people remember. Moscow indicated it might recognize the old debts in exchange for very long terms and no interest, and offered oil concessions in the Caucasus as compensation for the nationalizations. It failed, and the reason it failed is almost comic. The Anglo-Dutch oil interests were prepared to take the deal on the concessions. The American oil interests were not, because those concessions had been carved out of properties they considered theirs. The largest sovereign debt negotiation in history stalled, and a commercial quarrel between two oil companies was a large part of why. And here is the fact that I find the most human in this entire story. The French bondholders did not give up, not for decades. They organized. Associations of holders were formed and kept going through the 1920s, the 1930s, the occupation, the Reconstruction, the whole of the Cold War, electing officers, printing bulletins, petitioning ministers, lobbying every French government that showed the faintest sign of talking to Moscow about anything. 3 generations of secretaries and treasurers keeping alive a claim on a state that had said no in 1918 and never wavered. And the certificates themselves stayed in the houses. They were not thrown away. They were kept in the drawer with the deeds and the birth certificates, because throwing them away would have been an admission, and because everybody had heard of somebody whose cousin had held on and been proved right about something. This is the detail I keep coming back to. The paper had no legal force whatsoever after 1918. It was kept anyway for 80 years as a kind of family document. And this is the extraordinary part, established by a study of the actual market prices. 2 years after the repudiation, Russian bonds were still trading in Paris at close to half their face value. Half, on paper that had been formally and publicly annulled by the government that issued it. That was not stupidity. There were 3 rational reasons to hope. The Bolshevik regime might reverse itself, as it partially did on other economic questions. The regime might fall, and a successor government might want access to capital markets badly enough to settle, or the French state and the French banks, which had, after all, encouraged the whole thing, might compensate the holders themselves. None of it happened, but the hope was priced and traded for the better part of a century. What was being bought and sold in Paris in the 1920s was not an investment. It was the possibility that history would be reversed. It turns out that has a market price, and the price is not zero. And now I have to correct myself a second time on the largest question in this video. Because the conclusion everybody draws from this story is the Bolsheviks refused to pay and nothing happened to them. Default is free. That is the lesson people take away, and it is the lesson I half expected to find when I started working on this. It is simply wrong. Soviet Russia was effectively shut out of long-term international capital markets for about 50 years. Not 5. 50. There was no meaningful foreign borrowing available to the Soviet state until the 1970s, and the little that existed was short-term trade credit at punitive terms. Economists who study sovereign default generally find that the punishment is mild and the exclusion is short. This case is the exception that proves how bad it can get, not an illustration of the rule. And the bill did not disappear. It changed pair. When the Soviet Union industrialized in the 1930s, it needed German and American machinery, turbines, tractor plants, entire factories bought and shipped. A normal country pays for that by borrowing. The Soviet Union could not borrow, so it paid with the only thing it could export in quantity: grain, sold abroad in the years when the Soviet countryside was starving. I should be exact here, because this point gets exaggerated. Grain exports were in fact cut back sharply during the worst of the famine in 1932 and 1933. The historians who have gone through the harvest and procurement records are clear about that, and anyone who tells you exports continued at full volume through the famine is overstating it. But the structure is undeniable. A state with no access to credit has to extract its investment from its own population, in kind, immediately. That is what having no creditors actually means. The debt of 1918 was paid. It was simply not paid by the people who signed for it, not in francs, and not to anyone who had lent. Now I have to deal with something else, because this subject sits next to one of the most poisonous stories on the internet, and going around it would be cowardly. The story is that Wall Street financiers funded the Russian Revolution. It usually comes with a specific claim about $20 million supposedly given to Trotsky by the New York banker Jacob Schiff. There is no primary source for it. The canonical version traces back to a newspaper article from 1949 attributing the remark to a relative, and it is contradicted by everything Schiff actually did. He backed the provisional government in 1917 and turned firmly against the Bolsheviks after October, funding groups opposed to them until his death in 1920. There is also a famous bundle of documents obtained by an American official in 1918 and published to prove that the Bolshevik leadership was on the German payroll. They were examined in detail by the historian and diplomat George Kennan in the 1950s, who established they were forgeries, wrong letterheads, anachronistic administrative language, documents supposedly from different offices typed on the same machine. That conclusion has stood ever since. Here's what I find so strange about all this. The invented version is not even the best story, because German money in the Russian Revolution is real, and it is documented from Germany's own diplomatic archives, published in the 1950s. Berlin funneled substantial sums through intermediaries to destabilize the Russian war effort, and it moved Lenin himself across Germany in a sealed train in April 1917, precisely because it expected him to take Russia out of the war. That is not a theory, that is German state policy in the German files, and it worked. And Schiff's actual financial war against the Russian Empire is a better story too. In 1904 and 1905, during the Russo-Japanese War, he organized a series of loans to Japan totaling in the order of $200 million, publicly, deliberately, and for a stated reason: the pogroms and the official anti-Semitism of the Russian state. He helped fund the war that broke the empire's prestige, said openly why, and never touched the Bolsheviks. The truth is more interesting than the forgery, it usually is.
One more correction, and this one matters because you will hear the phrase everywhere.
You will be told that the doctrine of odious debt, the idea that a population is not bound by debts a tyrant contracted against its interest, was born from this Russian repudiation. It was not, and the jurist whose name is attached to it would be dismayed by how he is used. He wrote in 1927 in exile in Paris, and he was mainly synthesizing 19th century precedents. More importantly, his default rule was the opposite of what people claim. He held that debts survive changes of regime as a matter of course, and treated the odious exception as narrow. It has never been established international law, and the version quoted online today was largely constructed decades later by campaigners for debt cancellation in the developing world. Using him to justify the decree of 1918 turns him inside out. So the settlement finally. Britain went first in 1986. In the Thatcher and Gorbachev years, a mutual release of pre-war claims tidied up as part of a general improvement in relations. France took 11 more years, a memorandum in November 1996, then an agreement signed in Paris on the 27th of May 1997, full and final settlement of all reciprocal claims arising before May 1945. Russia paid $400 million, 8 installments of $50 million, spread to the year 2000, and the payment went to the French state, not to the holders. The French government then ran a register. 316,219 people came forward, holding around 9.2 million certificates. The compensation was capped, and only a portion of the $400 million was allocated to bondholders at all. The rest went to other categories of claim. The recovery rate, measured against what had been claimed, was in the order of 1%. The French parliamentary record puts it lower still. The first checks went out in the year 2000, 82 years after the decree. Nobody who bought a bond in 1906 was alive to receive one. What arrived, in most cases, was a modest payment to a grandchild who had inherited a folder of beautiful engraved paper and a family story about money that was supposed to be safe. And then there's the timing, which nobody planned and which reads like something out of a novel. The agreement closing the largest sovereign default in history was signed in May 1997. In August 1998, 15 months later, the Russian government defaulted on its domestic debt, devalued the ruble, and froze payments to foreign creditors. Hedge funds collapsed. A very famous one in Connecticut had to be rescued by a consortium of banks to stop the damage spreading through the American financial system. Russia had settled the account of 1918 and opened a new one within a year and a half. I am not making a point about national character here. Plenty of countries have defaulted twice, and several of the states lecturing Moscow at Genoa in 1922 had done exactly that. The point is narrower, and it applies everywhere. A debt settlement does not fix the thing that produced the debt. It closes a file. That is all it does, and it is worth remembering the next time one is announced as the end of a story. So what is the real lesson here? It is not that governments sometimes fail to pay. Everybody knows that. The lesson is about what a government bond actually is. And almost nobody says it plainly. When you buy the debt of a state, you are not buying a claim on that state's assets. There is no collateral. You cannot repossess a country. What you are buying is a bet that the political arrangement which signed the paper will still be standing when the paper matures, and will still consider itself the same entity that signed. Every other risk you can hedge. That one you cannot. And the French experience adds a second lesson that is, if anything, more uncomfortable. Those households were not reckless. They did everything a careful person is supposed to do. They bought a government security rather than a share. They diversified into an allied country. They took advice from their bank and read the coverage in their newspaper. Every one of those safeguards had been compromised, the newspaper by a subsidy, the listing by a foreign ministry that wanted the alliance more than it wanted a sober assessment of the risk, and the advice by an institution earning a commission on each issue. Nobody defrauded them. Every element was legal and, in its own terms, respectable. And we are still living with the machinery. When a state today freezes another state's reserves, or a government defaults and the courts fight for a decade over who is owed what, you're watching the same question that broke down at Genoa in 1922. Whether a country's obligations belong to its government or to the country itself. We have never answered it. We have only ever settled it. Case by case, for cents on the franc, when both sides finally want something else more than they want to be right. If you made it this far, drop a coupon emoji in the comments so I know you stayed till the end, for the millions of coupons that were never clipped. And tell me this, because I would like to know where you land. If a regime borrows money and the people overthrow that regime, should the people inherit the debt? France said yes for 80 years. Moscow said no in a single page. Courts and economists still argue about it every time a country defaults. Leave a comment. I read them all. If this kind of deep dive is what you come here for, subscribe. It genuinely helps these keep coming. I'll see you in the next one.